All right, we are live. So I
All
guess the
right.
intro music didn't queue up that time for some reason, Scott. So
Yeah, I didn't hear it. It's all good.
so that threw me off a little bit. But we are live. We're rolling, man. Well, cheers, my friend. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Scott Hendrick is with me today, and I will tell you in just a second a little bit about who Scott is. But first of all, Scott, I do just want to say thank you for your service. First of all, it's a privilege, really, just to know you. And I'm excited for our conversation today and just to spend some
Absolutely.
time with
Thank
you
you.
and talk to you and find out about a little bit about your background and some of the things that you're doing for veterans and first responders. And I'm just really excited about this conversation. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, hopefully it's going to be a good one. Thank you.
Yeah. And let's see. I was going to do the typical bio thing. I think I already told you about this, but I would really much rather kind of hear from you a little bit about your background, who you are, and what you do. Let me just mention a couple things. Scott Hendrick is the chief master is a chief master sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. He's also chief of operations for Liberty Organization for Veterans and First Responders, which is a nonprofit organization providing quality, free services to active duty wounded warriors, veterans, and first responders, as well as their families. And so, Scott, if you could just share a little bit with us about your background, your credentials, and then a little bit more about what you do.
Awesome. Absolutely. So, at the ripe age of 18 years old, fresh out of college dropout
Wow.
experience. Yeah. So, I
Come
came
on.
out of high school in the National Honor Society, the whole 9 yards. Experienced some things towards the end of my junior year that we'll talk about here a little bit later, trauma related. And it kind of had a fundamental shift in who I was as an individual. Kind of wasted my experience in college after one ripe semester. Ended back up at the house, living in my old bedroom, and my mom said, "Look, you need to go out into the world and figure life out." And so, contacted the recruiter, and off I went. Enlisted in the Air Force on the 15th of January, 1997. For some people, that sounds like probably a bazillion years ago. For me, it feels like yesterday, and 100 years all in the same time. So
Yeah.
took off, went to San Antonio, went through basic training. It was about 6 weeks through that, and then went to tech school, which was about 8 months to 10 months to learn how to be electronic warfare journeyman. So I did that for 20 plus years until I worked myself into a desk job. I ended up flying desk every day for the last 6 to 8 years of my career, but culminated in the end, pushing a F-22 squadron here at Eglin Air Force Base for about a year until I decided to retire. So that was a huge turn of events and everything. And then, some say, "Oh, how are you on active duty and you have a goatee?" I'm participating in the Skills Bridge program right now. And so basically what that is you get the last 6 months of your enlistment, you get to go learn new skills to kind of help you transition from active duty into civilian. So if the company or organization, to include nonprofits, qualifies based on their mission and how extensive their training is and what you'll learn, that's a skill bridge program that I'm participating in, and now I'm working with Liberty Organization for Veterans and Emergency Responders, where I'm currently the chief of operations, which is like the master of everything all the time, drinking from a fire hose. When we first got the training rip that was sent to me, and it's broken down week by week, everything that you learn from marketing to funding to everything about how to run a nonprofit organization. So it's been like drinking from a fire hose for the last 6 months, which has been exciting, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, what led you to? Well, actually, I don't want to. Let's go ahead and do that now. What led you to, as part of the? You said it's the Skills Bridge program.
Skill Bridge.
It's Skill Bridge, excuse me. As part of the Skill Bridge program, what led you specifically to work with the organization that you are working with now?
Okay, so I got back from my deployment. I spent 7, 8 months ish in the Middle East, and I saw some things basically on computer systems. I wasn't directly involved, but saw a lot of things via IT to validate and verify that subsystems that we were responsible for were working and working effectively. So you get to see those things over and over and over again. At first, you're like, "Wow, this is really cool, right? We're over there, we're doing our nation's bidding. This is, we're fighting the good fight, right? Like everybody says."
Yeah.
And then the gravity of the situation, the humanity part of it starts to weigh on you after a while, right? You watch infrastructure get blown up, you watch bridges and things of that nature, and there's no emotional attachment to that. You see it and you're like, okay, great, that blew up. But when you see, other things, that's when, things start to weigh on your mind, and you start to, it has effects, right? You can't look at that stuff and not have an effect on you from a morality perspective and from a mental aspect as well. So, things start getting a little difficult to carry. So I got back from the Middle East, and a friend of mine called me, sent me some messages. He saw my welcome home. The thing, everybody goes to the airport and they take the obligatory pictures, and the family's there and everybody's there, and everybody's happy, but you're struggling, right? There's a lot. It's very heavy. And so, you step back, you try to step back into that normal life. And so this individual saw those Facebook photos, and they said, "Look, man, like, you have the 300-yard stare, like something's wrong." And I was like, "Nothing's wrong with me. Like, I don't know what you're talking about," right? Denial, the whole 9 yards. So they said, "Look, let's get you down to Tallahassee. There's a program where you can learn this protocol. It'll help you with your PTSD. It'll help, neutralize those negative emotions and things of that nature." So I went and did that, and that was through the Research Recognition Project. That's Dr. Frank Burke, right? And so I'm not a licensed mental health counselor, and they're like, "Hey, we want to test this out and see if normal, like civilians, but military, right?" So when I say civilian, not a licensed mental health counselor, but someone who hasn't had that training or certification to be able to administer this, would it work, and could you efficiently and effectively administer the protocol? And so I went through that, and I felt immediate results. The squadron that I was working in at the time, I brought somebody with me and said, because his PTSD was way worse than mine, right? That's what we all do. We all validate and say, well, his is worse than mine, so let's help him. And I was doing the same thing. So I figured if it was going to, work, I wanted it to work for me as well as the guy that works for me back in the squadron. So, and it did, it worked magnificently. And then, so over the next 2 years, what I did is, I just, when I saw someone struggling, I would say, "Hey, would you like some help with this?" Right. I noticed some things. Yeah. Would you like some help? And a vast majority of the people are like, "Yeah, like I've been struggling for a long time." Right. And so that, for me as a senior enlisted leader in the Air Force, that was a huge tool to have in my toolbox. I could see and spot something in somebody, and then kind of walk them through the protocol. And next thing you know, they're feeling refreshed. They're sleeping better at night, And so that was very rewarding, like super rewarding to see people overcome the trauma, overcome things that they've been carrying for, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years. And so I did that for a while. And then my wife's cousin reached out to me, and she said, "Hey, do you still do that thing?" Because people don't really know, when we talk about protocols and modalities and things of that nature in the licensed mental health world, a lot of people don't really understand what that is, right? So they say, "Hey, do you do that thing," right? Or brain voodoo, or whatever you want to call it. And so I said, "Yeah, I still do the thing." And so she said, "Hey, would you mind? I have a really good friend of mine who's the president of a nonprofit organization that helps veterans and emergency responders. Would you mind working with him?" And his name, is Mike. And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So I called up Mike. Said, "Hey, man, tell me about your organization," and he wanted to know about what we did. So we chatted for about an hour on the phone. And I said, "All right, I said, this is what I'll do. I'll fly to Virginia because that's where he's at. I
Mm.
said, I'll fly to Virginia on my own dime. I'll come to you and I'll work with you for about 40 minutes, 2 days. And if you don't feel any different, then you never see me again, right? There's no big deal. You don't have to vocalize your trauma. You don't have to tell me about your trauma. We'll run through the protocol, and then if you feel better, then we have a decision to make. And he's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool. Like, haha,
Mm-hmm.
He said, well, what's the decision? And I said, well, if you feel better, then it's our responsibility to add this to your nonprofit's mission and then take this nationwide. Because he had been dealing predominantly in the Norfolk, Hampton Roads area, helping veterans with homelessness and jobs and all kinds of wonderful work. And he said, okay, deal, right? So he's a lieutenant colonel, retired Marine, right? Polar opposite of me, right? So officer, Marine, enlisted Air Force. There were some jokes back and forth, about five-star hotels and, maybe the Marines eating crayons from time to time. And so after we had some banter, I said, okay, cool. I'm going to fly in and work with you. And so that's what I did. And I met with him. He was super excited about, meeting me and kind of going through this because he, and the only reason I'm sharing this is because he openly shares this story as well.
Mm.
He'd been through, the medication. He had been through, inpatient, outpatient, all kinds of stuff, still seeing a therapist the whole time, not being able to process, that trauma that he had been holding on to for a very long time. So I met with him, worked with him for about 40 minutes, and he was just blown away, like completely blown
Wow.
away about, how he could think about the trauma and there wouldn't be a visceral emotional response within him in which he couldn't control his emotions. And, we kind of talked through what that meant and how it worked and removing the negative attachment to the memory and moving the memory into the part of the brain where it belongs for long-term storage versus, kind of hanging out and residing in your amygdala where it's fight, flight, freeze, or fold. When you think
Mm.
about it, your body's reaction is just instant and it's involuntary. And sometimes you don't even know what's going to happen and it happens. And so when we got done, I looked at him and I said, okay, like now we have a decision to make. Is this something that, you think we can take nationwide? And he's like, absolutely, let's do it. And so, it just so happens within several months after that, I applied for the Skills Bridge coordinate, to be part of the Skills Bridge program. And then we got Liberty approved as an approved organization. And then, we just hit the ground running from there and building and building and building and building into
Mm.
kind of what we are today.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I had a question here, so I'm gonna just mention the name again of the nonprofit. It's Liberty Organization for Veterans and Emergency Responders. Um, and Scott, something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned that sort of reunion with the family of somebody who's been in the military, somebody who's been, maybe deployed or on active duty or something like that, and then coming home and being reunited with the family, and there's that photo moment and everybody's happy and celebrating. But then what you mentioned is that so often internally for the man or the woman who's returning from that situation,
Right.
whether they were gone for, whether it was a matter of months or years, whatever we're talking about, they're returning from that really completely life altering, life changing experience, and kind of being in the moment, but sort of at the same time feeling like maybe not fully able to deal with, or not having come to grips yet with the fact that, like, that part of my life has come to an end, or it's in a break or something like that, and I'm home now, and sort of being in that atmosphere of I'm sure wanting to reconnect with family and friends, but again, there being this piece of them that's just been forever changed. Their life has been forever changed and affected by the life that they've now lived and experienced as a somebody who's been in a military context. How normal, I mean, would you say that is for men and women that are returning home after having been on a deployment or something like that, and returning home, and it's like the family, the friends don't really know what they've gone through. Obviously, they can't fully understand what they've been through. But how normal would you say that is for that sort of disconnect to take place in the mind of the person that's returning and now trying to kind of get to jump back into civilian lifestyle? And how normal would you say that is? And then if you could talk a little bit about some of the difficulty that's involved there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's from an environmental perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my wife and I have been married for a very long time. She's been with me through the entire career, Air Force career. And, I've been to Korea twice on 365. So I was gone for 365 days, unaccompanied
Wow.
tour. And the first time we didn't have any kids, but the second time we did. And so she was raising, my son was, 8 months old, I think, at the time when I left. And so when I came back, he was 18 months, right? I mean, it just, time flies, right? You come back for a mid-tour for a month, and then you go back for 6 more months. So, he goes from, 8 months old to 20 months old. And there's a huge difference, right? For your kids and for your family. And so what ends up happening is, as a family unit, everybody has their roles and responsibilities within the family unit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you understand and know those rules and norms, right? So if it's my job to take out, like, just something simple, right? Take out the trash. And
Sure.
then if my wife did, the planning for whatever, grocery stores or whatever it is, right? And then, so we all had shared resources and responsibilities. And then you pick up and you move and you're gone for 8 months, right? Everything that you did now gets absorbed by her. And then while you're gone, everything that she did, you get absorbed, right? So there's some autonomy that has to happen within your own self to be able to navigate that. And then you get used to that, right? You get used to whatever it may be. And I'm telling you, it may be something as simple as what time you eat. And then when you come back together now, then there's that meshing period where you have to figure out what all that means, right? And these are just the roles and responsibilities prior to leaving for that deployment. Then sprinkle on top any trauma that may have happened, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, the first time I was in Korea, somebody showed up at our house. So my wife, no kids, at the house, 2:00 in the morning, the doorbell rings, answers the door, and somebody says, "Oh, I noticed you're alone and your husband's been gone for a while, whatever." And so she's like, "Hey," shuts the door, the whole 9 yards. And next thing you know, she wakes up the next morning and the tires are slashed on the car, right? That's traumatic. So somebody's been watching the house, somebody's been paying attention, and then there's an action now against that, right? And so that's trauma, right? Or like when I was in Korea, they fire missiles over, North Korea will launch missiles ever so often. And you hear about it and you see it on TV, but when you're in the country and the alarms, everybody's getting the alert and you're in the military, and so everybody's on higher alert, that's traumatic, right? Because you get rocketed out of bed at 2:00 in the morning, and that's traumatic. So just the mesh point of normal roles and responsibilities and learning how to fit back together. And then on top of that, you sprinkle in whether it's, PTSD or just, the craziest things. And you can ask any military spouse. The craziest things are always going to happen when the other spouse is deployed. It just does, right? It just does. The transmission blows up. Something always happens and then they're having to navigate that when you're, 5 time zones away, right? And then on top of that, you have trauma, right? And so from a spouse and a family unit, everybody's glad to have you back. Everybody, so you're trying to figure out those roles and responsibilities again, to include kids, right? So our kids get up and they have a routine. And if for me, I'm not familiar with that routine, and then I go to inject myself into that routine again, what happens, right? There's strife. And even at the kid level, because the kids are like, "Hey, wait a minute, we don't we don't do this first. We do this first and then this.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
throws off that routine, which adds to frustration. And then you have frustration, you have roles and responsibility conflict, and then you have trauma on top of it. So to be able to navigate through all of that time and time and time again, I was lucky. I did 2 365s to Korea, and then I did a deployment early, wasn't very long, to the Middle East, and then another 210 here recently. I'd say, wow, it's been 5 years now. But so, 5 significant events over 22 to 26 years. And that's tough to navigate. It's tough to navigate
Yeah.
from a family perspective, from a career perspective, right? Because when you get back, there's also getting back into the unit, reuniting and integrating back into the unit. And then, because while you were gone, somebody did that job. They just did. And life moves on. And so sometimes that's tough to navigate too, to figure out where you fit in the unit again, where you fit at in home again, how you've changed as an individual over the past, insert whatever, 6 to 12 months. And, what does that do? So the average human only has, 2 or 3 pivot points in their life where they fundamentally change direction.
Wow.
And that's just a known fact, right? So for the most part, we're good. And then you have some epiphany, or you have an event that transforms your direction and you move in a different direction. And that only happens, 2 to 3 times in one's lifetime. And so during those events, those pivots, super, super tough. Sprinkle in alcohol abuse, things of that nature. And now it muddies the waters even more, right? It's harder to navigate because now you're self-medicating and you're trying to navigate this on your own, right? And from a very, very young perspective, joining the military, adapt and overcome, improvise, right? All these things are normalized in our thought process, right? You can figure this out. It wasn't until here recently where we valued more of the team and how do we leverage everybody's, talents within the team in order to navigate whatever it is. So that's difficult because for us, we can fix this. We did this, I went through this, now I can fix this and then move on with life. And now that we've started to normalize a little bit more the mental health perspective of it, people are starting to come out a little bit more and feeling more open to share, what their story is and what they've gone through.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for sharing. That's actually super helpful, because it's hard for somebody like me who, I've never been in any kind of a military context, and there's, a lot of people like me, I'm guessing, and wanting to understand, that's the reason I've been having several of these conversations lately. And by the way, I should mention, just a shout out to Dr. Janelle Royster for connecting us together and helping us to kind of initiate this conversation here. I've been having a lot of these conversations lately because I want to know more. I want to know, because it's a problem. There's so many issues associated with this. And I think one of the things that I didn't understand until I started having these conversations, and even in what you just said just now, some light bulbs were going off in my mind. I'm like, oh, so yeah, it's so much more than just the fact of being away in a context where maybe there's some trauma and then there's some post-traumatic stress as a result. And, it's these different things like that, right? But then it's not just that. It's also all the other stuff that's weighing on you. Like if you do have a family back home and you're away from them for a year or 6 months at a time, or whatever the case may be, you have small kids at home that are growing up where you're like, thinking about all the stuff that you're missing out on, but yet living in this and having to live in this hyper vigilant state as a person who's in the military and, needing to work and very often times these life and death kind of situations where seconds matter, where milliseconds matter sometimes. And, these situations where you are, as you mentioned, you're being changed and transformed as an individual in terms of the way that you think, the way that you respond. And when you put all those things together, not just the fact of where you are and the stress of the job and the atmosphere and all of that, the fact that there's people whose maybe there's lives depend on you, all that kind of stuff, but then all the other stuff that's also weighing on your mind of life back home, and what am I missing out on, and all these other things.
Right.
And so it's light bulbs are going off in my head, and it's so easy, like when someone like you explains this to me, it's like, man, um there needs to be more knowledge around this. I think there needs to be more empathy around this. There needs to be more understanding. I think better education, just everything in general. And I think that these kinds of conversations are important to foster this kind of understanding. And one of the things that I think that I mentioned to you on the phone when we talked a couple weeks back, something that I really, really appreciate about what Liberty does, is that you also work with the spouses of
Absolutely.
those that are on active duty and that are veterans and that
Absolutely.
are emergency responders, because that's a whole nother side of the equation here, where I think so often the husbands and wives of those that are on deployment and that work in these emergency response jobs, that so much of what weighs on their minds and them holding down the fort at home and filling in the gaps and all of those kinds of things. And I just think that, again, I appreciate you for being here, and appreciate you for everything that you just shared, because you're helping me have better understanding so that I can be, more
Yeah.
knowledgeable, maybe
And
in some
so
ways
here's the
more
thing.
empathetic.
We all have these things, right? And so I don't want to glorify and say that, our military should, this and that and the other, right? Because that, if you ask anybody, right, when people say, "Oh, thank you for your service," and if you were to pull somebody aside and be in that subculture of the military and say, "How does that make you feel?" Like when someone says that, it makes you feel. For me, in my circle of friends, it makes you feel uncomfortable a little bit, right? Because
Okay.
because you think about it, some of these guys and gals like myself were 18 years old, right? I mean, the frontal lobe is not even fully
Mm,
developed. And so we've been in
sure.
that culture for so long, that's our norm, right? Our norm, what we do is normal to us. And so when people are like, "Oh, thank you so much," it's almost like, ugh, I don't know how to respond, right? So one of my
Mm,
mentors was like, "Hey, just say, hey, thank you for your support." Like, because that means just as much, that reciprocity, that,
okay.
hey,
I see.
thank you for that support, which is huge. And our first responders go through the same thing, right? But we all have our life, right? Like, for instance, right? You just mentioned that you had a newborn baby, right? So if you're
Mm,
out and about and your wife calls, she's like, "Hey, we need, right, diapers or whatever." And now in the back of your mind, like, "Okay, I got this. I gotta take care of that." And then, there may be, whatever it is, right? We all have a bazillion things going on that absorb our, attention span sometimes. And
sure.
you have folks that come for counseling, and you're thinking through that in the back of your head, and next thing you're backing out of a tight parking spot because you just got the diapers, but you're thinking about the counseling session, and you back into a car. Normally, you would never back into a car, right? You're always
Mm,
aware, but that's what happens. It's no different in the military. It's no different for our first responders. And trauma is trauma is trauma. It doesn't matter, right? So, for instance, we always focus on the military member, right? Getting shot at, getting blown up, getting this and that and the third. But when we do what we do and we run our folks through this protocol, sometimes it is the most recent trauma. But for a vast majority of the people, it's trauma from childhood. It's trauma
wow.
from
Okay.
years and years and years ago that they haven't been able to process. I'm a prime example of that, right? So when I was 13 years old, my cousin took his own life. That was a traumatic event for me, right?
Mm,
Going to the
sure.
funeral, reaching down, involuntarily reaching down and grabbing his hand as he was laying in the casket. That was the first time I touched a dead body. I completely froze. And that was very traumatic to me, right? That was very, very traumatic. And then, shortly thereafter, fast forward just another 6 years, my father on Christmas Eve night in 1994 had a double brain aneurysm.
Wow.
He survived, but that's trauma, right? And then that same day, Christmas Day, I got, my mom gave me money. We didn't have the most money in the world. We grew up okay, but we didn't have a lot. And mom gave me, I want to say it was $137. And she said, put this in your wallet because we're in downtown Richmond. And if we get robbed, they're going to rob me, not you. And just keep it safe. And so I was like, okay, fine. So we're sleeping in the floor of the MCV, Medical College of Virginia, waiting room for the neurosurgeon to figure, if he's going to save dad's life or not.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is somebody saw me take my wallet and slide it into the bag that I was laying my head on the floor, and they pulled my wallet out and took the $137, chucked the wallet can, and disappeared.
Wow.
And so that was very traumatic, to think about that. So for Christmas, for me, not a good time, at all. Like I didn't get excited about the lights, and I didn't get excited about any of that stuff. Now my dad survived, and he went on and lived for several years after that. But during that time frame, as a 17-year-old male at the time, I had a sister and a mother. So the idea that I had to, abandon any idea or hope of going to college and then go get a full-time job to help support the family and do all that and the responsibilities, because I saw what my father did for our family, for the family unit specifically. Taking that on at 17 years old, that was a big deal, right?
Yeah,
so for Christmas was not a good time. It was not. And even when I got married and we started kids, and that was not a really good time until I went through this protocol and I was able to process that memory. And then, now, it's like Clark W. Griswold at our house. We lights everywhere and huge celebration, as it should be.
awesome.
But that was very, very traumatic. Yeah. And it's from a long time. So people, I think there's a misconception. People automatically assume it's all combat related. Which is not, right? Of the 160 some people that we've worked with in the last, I think 125, 30 days, the average time that they've carried that trauma is 14 and a half years. So, if you're working with a 35, 40-year-old person, we're talking early adulthood trauma that people have carried. And, like we said, we work with veterans and emergency responders. So you would think it would be all, duty related, combat related things, but some of it is 15 years ago.
Wow. I have so many questions on that. So no, I mean, it's amazing to me the way that things stick in our minds, and how, you can have one of these experiences from the time when you're a child or you're a teenager or however old you are, but maybe, from a number of years ago, you have an experience that was traumatic, but, especially as a kid, like you don't even really know, unless someone tells you, you don't know that you're experiencing trauma. You just had a traumatic experience that maybe you kind of locked away. And now for whatever reason, you go the next several years, and I think that that's a story that a lot of people have of, there's so much fun and celebration and enjoyment around Christmas, but there's so many people, just for example, that go through the Christmas season and it's a miserable time for them because they connect that with the memory of having lost a loved one or having gone through something tragic, during that time of year. Or, people do that with birthdays, people do that with all kinds of different things, right? The way that things stick in our minds and they get connected, we connect memories with emotions in a certain way that I think becomes really, really difficult and challenging to process. Most of us are not that self-aware to even know that something's going on that needs to be processed. And then, so I guess what I'm wondering is, you're mentioning that oftentimes you may have somebody who's been in so somebody who's either active duty or they're a veteran or they're an emergency responder. And so they've been in traumatic situations on their job during their career, but it might be that there's actually something in their past that predated all of these things that was a source of trauma for them. Again, losing a loved one or just going through some kind of a traumatic experience. Do you think that there's I guess I'm wondering, I'm not totally sure how to phrase this question, so maybe you could help me decipher it a little bit. Is there a connection there? So is it that the trauma from the past becomes exacerbated by the more, maybe something that's more present that happens from being in a stressful environment and situation that can kind of cause that thing from the past that maybe wasn't having as big of an effect, or maybe it wasn't as prevalent in the mind of the person, but then experiencing some more recent trauma sort of causes that thing to kind of go off in their mind and now becomes something that is more emotionally challenging to walk through or something like that. Does it make sense what I'm asking you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's complex PTSD is what you're describing.
Okay.
That's what it boils down to is
Yeah.
in a vast majority of this is at the is at the unconscious level, right? It's in the background. Your body is a sensor. Everything around you is absorbing information all the time. Your brain's processing that all the time. And so when you have that traumatic event, and then you have cues, right, on a subconscious level, things that were there, right? So let's take this very simple. Let's say we're out in the wild and there's a lion. It's 85 degrees, the wind's blowing 5 to 10 miles an hour, the color of the wheat is this, whatever, right? And you almost died. So your brain records that. Now, only roughly, we know statistically speaking, about 10% of people are going to get PTSD. So you can expose 100 people to a very traumatic event. Statistically speaking, only 10 people is it really going to stick with and cause long-term chronic, right, effects of PTSD. So when your body absorbs all that information, it's always there, right, at the subconscious level. So when you're out and about and you see the color of the wheat or the sound that it was making or whatever was around that specific event, sight, smell, anything sight, smells, sounds, any of that stuff that your body would pick up on, that's when your amygdala starts to fire up, right? Be like, whoa, last time I was here, there was a big lion, and we almost died, and I don't want to die again, right? People call it a disorder. Your brain is actually working how it's supposed to, which is to keep you alive.
True.
To keep you alive. The last time you were in this situation, you almost died. So what are we going to do, right? We're going to we're going to divert blood from our extremities to our heart and lung and our thighs. Why? For that, so we can run faster and get away from whatever is going on, right? Or fight, flight, freeze, or fold. That's what the amygdala is there for.
Yeah.
So what happens over time is if you have complex PTSD, now you're starting to layer those things in there. So you could, theoretically speaking, that stuff could blur between event to event to event. So I've had the same whatever that trigger is, and you may not even know it. Like some people don't even know why. They'll have a panic attack and won't even know why. And it's their body's picking up on something and it remembers it. The brain is always recording. And so that's where, to get back to your question is how does that work, right? How does early trauma affect it's compounded. It's literally just compounded and layered on top of each other. And the good thing is with this protocol that we use, we can go all the way back and we can work on that first trauma or the worst trauma. And then once you give your brain a tool to use, well, now it can process all the other traumas. And so what ends up happening is we start with the first or worst, the first session, do 2 sessions. And then the second time we meet, we'll do 2 more on the opposite, right? So if we did first, let's say we did the worst on the first time, we'll do the first on the second time. And it's a bookend. And so all the traumas that are in between will release. And those memories that are stuck, for lack of better terms, in the amygdala with that negative attachment will disconnect and go to where they belong, up in the hippocampus part of your brain. And then you wake up in the morning and then some of this stuff that you don't even realize it until, days and weeks after you go through the protocol. When you recall that traumatic event, you're like, wow, I don't have a negative attachment to that specific memory. Normally, right, when I would think about something, I would get upset, or, for instance, let's say my cousin's suicide. As a senior enlisted leader of a squadron, sometimes 500 people in the squadron. And during commanders calls, you stand up and there's a ton of resources in the military for, suicide awareness and PTSD and things of that nature. And so as a senior enlisted leader, it is your job to get up there and make sure that everybody all the time knows about these resources, because you don't know, right? Like, you could have a young man or a woman come into your unit and be 18 years old, fresh out of tech school, and not understand all of the resources that are available to them.
Sure.
And that's a huge thing, right? And so, but the crusty 22-year, person who's been in forever is like, yeah, I've heard this, right? Like, get on with it. So before I did this protocol, I would stand up to my squadron and I would say, ladies and gentlemen, we have the chaplain, we have mental health, we have, the pillars of fitness, right? All these things that we try to work on to get you out of, a parasympathetic state of mind. A sympathetic state of mind, and be able to, not be resilient, just be more resilient and overcome whatever it is you're going on in your life, right? USA Today did a poll several years back and said the number 2, the most stressful job in the United States of America, number 2 on that list was enlisted military. So we know we live in a pressure cooker all the time,
yes.
Right? And that is another dynamic that we have to deal with, right? And so if it's physical fitness and running and getting that body moving, getting the endorphins moving, all helps out your mental health, right? Which is counter, you don't want to run. Trust me. If anybody's ever been through any depression or anything like that, you're like, I really don't feel like going running right now. Like, that's not my priority. The hardest things to do are the ones that are not on your priority list, right? And so it's super important. But as a senior enlisted leader, when I would stand up and I would get to the topic of suicide. Now, granted, I was 13 years old when my cousin took his life, right? He was 10. I was 13.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward 17 to 20 to 20, plus years in the future, when I would say, or just start to breach the conversation, my chest would just tighten up. I'd start sweating. And, I've done speeches, leadership speeches specifically for, 2,500 people. I have no problem public speaking. But when I talked on that topic, boy, that amygdala just fired white hot, took over everything. And every single time it had the exact same response. So if I moved from squadron to squadron, it did the exact same thing. And now, after I've gone through the protocol, I'm able to articulate those messages 1,000 times better. And not just that, right? So Scott Mann, if you've ever looked up any of his work, he's a lieutenant colonel, Green Beret. He has a TED Talk about the generosity of scars. And that's a huge scar that I had on my heart that, I couldn't cover up. From a physiological response, I could not cover that up. And now that I've gone through that protocol, I can openly talk about that, right? I can talk about walking into the room and seeing him for the first time, because they kept him alive. They tried to keep him alive to see if his brain would recover. And so I remember walking into the room and freezing and looking over in the corner, and my uncle talking to me about how, he can still hear you and he loves you and you can, give him, and all this stuff. And I was 13 years old at the time. It just, I couldn't deal with it, right? I couldn't deal. Wow. But that was imprinted on my brain forever. And to be able to articulate that, go into the viewing, right, before his funeral and what happened during that, and sharing that scar, right? they didn't understand because they see senior enlisted leaders, they see pretty much this is how it goes. Everybody in a leadership role, their lives are perfect. They don't have any stresses, and they walk around,
Right.
shooting sunshine and rainbows all the time.
Yeah.
And so for me to be able to share that scar, right? That fibrous
Mhm.
tissue, that connectivity tissue, now when I share those stories, I cannot tell you how many people come out of that crowd and come up to me and say, Chief, thank you so much for sharing that. I had a family member that did this, or, I had a spouse that did this, or I knew this person. And what you do is you start to make that bond. And when you make that bond, that generosity of a scar, like Scott says, Scott Mann, that's when you start to really, really, really form tight knit bonds of trust and mutual respect.
Wow.
And that is how you transform cultures, right? You transform cultures through, mutual respect and trust. But
Mm.
for me, I couldn't do that for a while. I couldn't share those stories, and now to be able to share that story is just fundamentally transformed how I view interacting with almost everybody. And so,
Mm.
a lot of people cover that stuff up, and they try to hide that scar. Where a vast majority, like the folks that really punch above their weight, those are the guys and gals who can stand on a stage, deliver a phenomenal message, right, and be very, very vulnerable. And then that vulnerability through a scar is how you start to make connections, build teams, and
Yeah.
really transform how your organization will work and push and drive. And so when you see that individual, I just don't see Duke, right? I see that phenomenal story that you've overcome or whatever it is, and that shared scar that we have is the foundation that we build off of. But without that, you really don't know, and it takes
Yeah.
years and years and years to get to know somebody, right? So that
Mm.
that is amazing to be able to use this protocol. Step one, take care of the trauma. Step two, right after that, I'll meet with them and say, all right, now you can share this, and the thing that has held you back forever, now you can use that to catapult yourself to even higher, right? Use that. And that's the first thing that I do. I share that. Go watch this TED talk because it's amazing. And then, reach back out to me, and then we can help you work on your story so you can connect with other
Yes.
human beings, right?
Yeah.
The human life experience is all about connections. And so that's what we are doing at Liberty, is helping people overcome that trauma and then helping them go live the life that they were put on this earth to do. You know,
Yeah.
that's the greatest thing that we can do for sure.
Yeah, what you just said speaks so much to the importance being of really experiencing healing and experiencing freedom in your mind. So we're talking about post-traumatic stress, complex trauma, being able to really experience that freedom. First of all, of course, for yourself so that you can have a better life, but also, on the other side of that is, now your life and your experiences can become a story that can help somebody else. So if you're able to articulate it and you're able to talk about it without those sort of, warning lights going off in your brain of I'm in a dangerous place and
Right.
I can't talk about this, but you have the freedom now to articulate what you've gone through and what you've experienced, because there are so many other people out there that have gone through something similar, or in some way that they can relate to the pain and the trauma that you've experienced in your past, and then you can actually help them to walk through and experience freedom and healing and growth in their life as well. And something that you said there that really stuck out to me, going back, I think several minutes ago, you said something about how, when your brain connects that memory with or connects emotions to that traumatic experience that you had. And so now that memory from your past, when something else kind of, you end up in a similar situation, whether it's because of something in your olfactory senses going off, you smell something that takes you back to that memory, or you see something, hear something, feel something, whatever it is that is happening that kind of reminds you of that experience and kind of pushes you to have that fight or flight response, that you said that that's actually your brain's normal response, and it's your brain actually trying to protect you. It's so interesting that there's
It's
so
working.
many things. What'd you say?
It's working. It's working overtime
Yeah.
to keep you alive.
Yeah. Yeah, like trying to protect you, trying to keep you alive. It's amazing that there are things that our brain does. Our brain does this in the way that our brain kind of holds on to information in terms of our subconscious minds. Like the way that our subconscious mind works, it likes to keep us safe, it likes to keep us comfortable. And so maybe I've got a really bad habit, and maybe I'm talking about an alcohol addiction, or I'm addicted to smoking cigarettes, or I'm addicted to pornography, or I'm addicted to whatever it is. And so that actually becomes in my brain's way of processing things, that becomes a sort of safe zone for me, so that now when I'm
Absolutely.
experiencing pressure of some kind, or I'm experiencing some kind of a struggle or stress in my life, this thing goes off in the back of my mind that says, oh, go get your escape in this thing. And it just becomes something that helps to kind of seemingly ease the pain for that moment. It's actually very detrimental to my mental health long term, but in my mind, it's been built up as this thing that's become very, very comfortable. It's become my comfort zone. And so my brain actually
Yeah,
fights in a
absolutely.
certain sense to kind of keep me
This
there.
is,
So yeah, go
yes,
ahead.
I love this topic. This topic is absolutely phenomenal, right? So I get all fired up with this topic because, you know, it's resistance, right? Your brain is working extremely hard to keep you at status quo. It just is,
Yeah. Yes.
right? Keep you safe, to reproduce, pass on your DNA. Those are like, as humans, we overcomplicate a ton of things. And one of them is, I think, life's existence. And our brain works extremely hard to keep the status quo, right? Just
Yes.
safe, comfortable, so it works. And so there's, resistance, right? Resistance, to give it a name, the things that you should be doing, the closer you get to your goal, the higher the resistance goes up, right? And
Yes.
resistance can show up in
Truth.
self-doubt. Like you said, it can show up in addiction. It can show up in procrastination, right? If
Absolutely.
procrastination was an Olympic sport, I'd be a gold medalist
Oh,
tomorrow,
bro.
right?
Yeah,
So
I'd be the
that sort
Michael
of thing.
Phelps of
Um,
of that sport.
yeah, but it would be tomorrow. It would be tomorrow. I do it tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Procrastination pays off now. Hard work pays off later. So those, that resistance is the same thing, right? Your brain's working super, super, super hard. And people, whether it's
Mm.
education, whether it's taking on a new job, whether it's moving, whether it's, anything you're passionate about, like you're true passionate about it, the closer you get to achieving it, if you think about it, this is a perfect example, right? So when you're going through college, there's a reason it's called senioritis, right? And you get in that last semester and all of those classes that you're like, oh, I don't want, the resistance starts to push back, because the
Mm.
idea or concept that, man, I've got to live on the other side of this with this degree, right? And now I have a responsibility to use it, to employ it, to all these things that I've learned, whatever it may be, just from an academic perspective, right? Is terrifying to the brain. Same way
Yes.
with trauma. Same way with trauma. We've figured this out, right? So trauma, let's say, suffer from trauma. Let's say I was in a horrible car accident, and that has stuck with me my whole life. And so everybody knows me as the guy who almost died in the car accident, right? And I have
Yeah.
what's called secondary gain, right? So people see me and they pick me up and they take me to work and they pick me up from work because they saw me go through this horrible thing. And for me, that's my comfort zone. I receive a lot of things through that trauma. And so I've learned to live in that. I've learned to maintain status quo, right? Just like we were talking about. And it becomes very comfortable.
So Scott, and
People
I'm
who have trauma, will stick in that comfort zone
Yeah.
because living life on the other side of the fence without trauma is even more fearful than what they've already gone through, because what they've gone through, they've learned to navigate. So I know when I work with someone, when Dr. Royster works with someone, if any of our practitioners work with someone, the first question they ask is they say, do you want to get better? Yes or no? And if the answer is not involuntarily yes, then we move on. Because if you're not committed to getting better, and if you're not willing to take that step because you're holding on to that secondary gain of, I receive all of these things to help me navigate through life, and I have this network of people who are lifting me up and working to do everything for me. Now, I'm not saying they're not going through some serious things and fighting battles that the average person can't even imagine, right? I'm very empathetic to that. But I also know that it is blindly terrifying. There's a famous poet that says it's not our darkness that most scares us, right? It's not the fear that most scares us, it's our light.
Yeah, that's Marion Williamson, I think it is. Yeah.
Yes. And so, and that, because some people can't see that. Some people can't see, whatever it may be, leading a Fortune 500 company, or, whatever it is they're passionate about, right? Being an Olympic athlete. All these things absolutely scare the living bejesus out of people. And that keeps them, and the brain keeps them in status quo, right? There's a reason people don't get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go running. And it's not because, they don't hate that, because you look on the other side, like, what is my responsibility? Those scare me more than the struggle, the grind, right? Because they don't know what that is. That's unknown. That's uncharted, unknown territory. And for the average person, that is terrifying.
Yes.
But when we go around, it's the fear, it's darkness that scares us. It's this, and this, it's not. It's really not. It's like, oh my God, like it's called self-actualization, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The top tier is self-actualization. And so when you can really step into that, right? Like, for instance, Michael Jordan, right? Michael Jordan is at self-actualization. LeBron James, self-actualization. Tom Brady, self-actualization. But there's very, very rare does anybody actually reach that level in their life. Sure. And so that scares people, absolutely scares people. And it's no different with trauma. They've learned to live with trauma. They have folks around them that help them navigate and stay in that status quo because it's comfortable for them. And they've learned that is, they know that, but it's more difficult to live on the other side and the prospect of absolute prosperity, and not understanding, which is difficult. That's just one of the millions of facets that go along with trauma and just human performance in general.
Scott, this is something that I talk a lot about in the area of growth and leadership, and it's with that, the idea that you just expressed so beautifully with, kind of coming to the edge of your comfort zone. That example that you gave of, being a senior and you're looking forward to like what's coming up next, which is terrifying. And so these things start to go off in your mind to kind of like try to almost self-sabotage, right? To kind of keep you where you are. And it just seems like, well, every person, we all have a comfort zone. And for some, it's really, really, it's like really close. For others, it's further out, but we all have a comfort zone. And in order for us to really continue to experience growth and advancement in our life, we've got to continually push beyond the confines of what's comfortable for us, right? Because I think that not a whole lot of growth happens when you are inside your zone of comfort. And so kind of like pushing past those boundaries. But it does seem that way, that the closer you get to the edge of what's comfortable for you, the more it seems like all hell breaks loose. And the more it seems like your brain just kind of works against you to try to keep you in that place where it's comfortable. And so this is something that I feel like this might be a sticky conversation, but I feel like you just kind of opened the door to it. You talked about um basically people like, yeah, like hiding behind trauma, hiding behind past experiences, hiding behind. So and look, and this is why I say this is sticky, because I don't ever want to have this conversation in a way that comes off as judgmental, or in a way that comes off as like
Right.
belittling what somebody's going through. And it doesn't matter, if what you're going through is not as bad as what that guy's going through, because the trauma that you've experienced, like the worst thing you've ever gone through is the worst thing you've ever gone through. It doesn't matter if it's like, if I put it on a scale and said, oh, it wasn't as bad as what happened to me or what happened to that guy. That's not the point. The point is, like, for you, it's real. And that response is happening in your mind, where your brain is trying to protect you. And so, okay, so here's where I'm going. I think that we can hide behind these things that are detrimental to us, because in the moment it feels safer. I think that we can start to define ourselves according to our past experiences, according to our trauma, according to depression. We start to say things like my depression. We start to say things like my, even like with physical illnesses, you'll hear people like my diabetes, like that kind of thing, where I'm like, hold on, maybe don't internalize it and take so much ownership over it, because granted, it's something real that's happening, but it's also something that you can begin to deal with. And so where is that line between, because I feel like we definitely want to empathize with people where they are, right? And not belittle anybody's trauma, pain, suffering, anything like that. But at the same time, where is that line where it's like, okay, but you're hiding behind something that you think is actually making you feel safe, but it's not letting you actually experience real freedom. So, at what point is there that tough love thing that, sometimes people need, that kind of like kick to kind of make those choices, to make those decisions, to really start to pursue and to go after these things? I think you definitely touched on this when you were talking about that first initial question that you asked, like, do you actually want this? Do you actually want to get better? Because
Right.
if you don't, there's no amount of anything that I'm going to say that's going to help you get there. But I guess just
So
like that
yeah.
line between
So
empathy and tough love, and how that can kind of be navigated for people.
as humans, I mean, we have to understand and realize we can't fix everything. We just can't. Right.
Sure.
And especially, married males know this more than anything, right? We can't fix everything, right? Sometimes it's just to listen. And so if people want to voice their trauma and talk about it, have, the emotional breakdowns and things of that nature, and get that out, there's a reason talk therapy is there, right? And that's a thing. It just is, right? It's a thing. On the scale, the spectrum of, is it effective or is it efficient? That's for the scholars to debate. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I think to ultimately get to your question, like, how do we help people just take that leap, right? That leap of faith. I think it has to do with trust. I know trust is a huge, huge thing, and sharing that generosity of a scar, right? So if I can share my story and I can teach other people once they're on the other side of the trauma to share their scars, then with the normalization of mental health, right? Not the over dramatization of mental health, but the normalization of, yes, like, I'm having a hard time. Where before, you think about it, our greatest generation, raised my parents, and now, so it kind of trickled down a little bit, that grit, that tough it out, kind of go back to work,
Right.
For
Right.
instance, shoot, I want to say it was 8 weeks after my dad had brain surgery, he was back on a heavy piece of equipment working construction. He just,
People
that,
were
and
built
I saw
differently
that.
back then. Yeah.
And I saw that. And my parents were way, like, my mom and dad waited extremely late in life to have me and my sister. And so I'm still connected to that type of mentality, where I saw my dad, he was working steam fittings, and chopped off the tip of his finger, literally chopped off his finger. and he picked his finger up and they put it in a bag of ice and went back to the hospital. They sewed it back up, put a big bandage on it, and then the very next day he was right back on the piece of equipment, with his finger bandaged up, all big, holding on to doing his thing, right back to work.
Bro, I remember one time I was just gonna say, one time my dad was up in a tree and he had an axe and he was chopping branches off, and he I don't know what happened. He was up on a ladder in a tree, chopping branches, and whatever he did, he came all the way around and he landed the axe in his kneecap. And so my dad climbed down from the tree, grabbed a beach towel. We had a pool, so there were always like towels hanging on the sides of the deck, the railings of the deck. Right. And so he climbed down from the tree, grabbed a beach towel, wrapped around his knee, jumped in the car, drove himself to the hospital, came back home like hours later, and that was the first that we had heard that happened. It was just like, there was just a toughness that was just like, I know I wouldn't be doing that. I'd be on the floor screaming, like, call an ambulance. You know what I mean? It was a different breed of
those norms, those small, like, we watch that, that's a big deal. And those small norms get passed down right from generation to generation. And just like, when I grew up, you finished everything on your plate. Why? Because my dad grew up during the Great Depression when they didn't know what was going to be on the plate tomorrow. So you better eat it all today. And so that gets passed down. And it's very hard for me when I see my kids, right? Because I have three young kids. And when I see them not eat, my natural reaction is to say, hey, you got to finish that. You got to eat all your food. You got to eat all your food. And then I have to stop and say, okay, why? Why am I saying that? Right? Because that was passed down. That was my great grandfather's perspective. And the same thing goes with mental health, right? You think about it. My dad didn't talk about mental health. His dad didn't talk about mental health. None of this stuff was normalized. And so to normalize this, and we have more people talking about it, I think is the first step, right? That's step one. Step two is I think we have to have phenomenal individuals in that arena, force multipliers, who can share these stories, share that generosity of a scar, build that trust, show people what it looks like on the other side of the fence. And then as that happens, then you start pulling people across the fence with these tools that have been developed and refined over time, i.e. the protocol that we use to get people on that other side. And then when they're on the other side and they can release that trauma and the effects of the trauma, then they can, you get them into leadership development courses and you get them into, whatever it may be, self-improvement wise, right? I worked with a young man who suffered from trauma from age 18 to 35. He was 35 when I worked with him, right? So he was 17 years of trauma. Horrible, horrible trauma. You name it, every pill in the world he took for anxiety, depression, you name it, like everything. College dropout, struggling, in his career, struggling with his fitness, just struggle, right? He was on the struggle bus. And now he does public speaking. And after he's gone through the protocol, on stage, he has an axe and knives because he had to have weapons on him at all times. And he has pill bottles, all empty pill bottles, like stacked up, right? That showed his before life, right? And now afterwards, he has, he's real big into fitness and he runs, he does all the virtual online running. And so he wins all these medals. He went and now he's working on a master's degree in theology. Like, this dude has just transformed his life. But that sticking point was the trauma. And so, and he does phenomenal, right? Dan Starr is his name. Absolutely phenomenal young man and wonderful wife and him and his family. And so that visual representation of the two vastly different aspects of life. And I think if we can show that, right? Like if we could get Dan Starr on the national news and cover his story right? That would be even more impactful, in my opinion, than right Simone Biles taking a knee during the Olympics,
Mm-hmm.
or other professional athletes that are willing to say, you know what, my mental or physical health is more important than this game or this job or this career, right? Because they're not playing the infinite game. It's very short term goal focused. Go, 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 the whole 9 yards. And so I think when we start to normalize that and we start to share those stories, those Dan Starr stories of just the polar opposites of how those lives have been lived within the same individual, and then what transformed them and what got them on the other side of the fence, and then what happens when you're on the other side of the fence and your aperture is opened up a lot more and you understand resistance and you do maybe some life coaching and you do some self-improvement, right? Whether it be in the form of education or just taking care of your body, right? Like you only get one
Yeah.
body.
Yeah.
You got to make it last, and if not, that's going to fail you. Like my right after I graduated high school, I told you about how my dad was. There's Chuck Norris and then my dad, right? I mean, he was that tough. And then
Yeah.
so I remember him, getting a cup of coffee and sitting there holding a cup of coffee, and my dad wasn't educated, right? And he didn't have a college degree, and he worked construction his whole life. And so he's sitting there holding the cup of coffee, and he looks at me, and in my all of 18 years of wisdom in life, he looks at me and he says, Scott, he says, your body will fail you. It just will. It's not going to last forever. And the reason he was holding a cup of coffee is because the heat would warm up his arthritis, right? And he had the big
Mm.
knuckles, and so as he's sitting there telling me this, and a vast majority of my life, I didn't listen to what my dad said because I thought I was smarter than him anyway.
Sure.
And he didn't graduate and all this stuff, right? And so in my head, I'm like, listen here, old man, I'm good. But for whatever reason, and it may be God's intervention, but I'm super blessed that I was mature enough at the time to just shut up and listen. And he
Mm.
said, your body, you cannot rely on your body. Your brain is an infinite resource, and you can do anything as long as you use your brain. If you
Wow.
go to your body first, your body will fail you, and you have to
Wow.
go use your brain. And so that I got into the military. I did my 4 years, and that's when my wife pushed me very hard because I joined the military to get an education. And at the end of my 4 years, I didn't have an education, and I really didn't have any experience in the career field that I was in. And so that's when I started my education. I ended up with a master's degree, but it came from that. I remember it like it was yesterday. Him holding that
Mm.
coffee, riddled with arthritis in his hands, getting up, and he was old. He was already,
Yeah.
60 years old at that time, and going to work and working construction every day to provide for his family. And him saying, look, you have to use your brain. Your body will fail you. Your brain,
Wow.
you can use it. It's an infinite resource. And that's, but once you get over that trauma and you realize that with great life coaching, so a great support system, you start to share that star, right? And you start to build that trust. And that's just a launch pad for success. And then
Wow.
you can take off, right? You can take off and you can get over those barriers that you were talking about in your brain way quicker when you have everybody rallying around you, lifting you up, for a positive thing about where you're going in your life. And the same
Mm.
thing, the same support system that you had on the other side of the fence with your PTSD is going to love you the same on this side. And they're going to lift you up even more because they want to see. I mean, we
Wow.
want to see people succeed.
It's so good, man. Those words of wisdom from your dad that goes along so well with what you're talking about with resiliency and this concept of like anti-fragility, right? And I think that we do for sure. I think that we're definitely overall people tend to be we're softer today. Things come a lot more easily to us. It's easier to get food. It's easier to, yeah, for the average person, let's say. It's easier to do a
Right.
lot of, especially in this country, right? Like it's easy, like a lot of things come easier to us. And I think doing things like you were talking about, getting up and running, and just like just different things that you can do to kind of train your mind, your brain, and then that does have an effect on your body as well, of course. But to train yourself to sort of develop some resiliency in life, I think that's really really essential. And I think that one of the things that I would really like to see is more of a more of an acceptance around that, of sort of like, being resilient and being strong, but um also with an acceptance of your emotions, with an acceptance of it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to admit when you're struggling. It's okay to admit, one of the things I think that you and I talked about last time when we were on the phone, we talked a little bit about that, of like how it's not very normal for somebody, for the average person, to just admit I'm struggling. Like that's not like a normal thing. Even if we're not talking about people that are in, military or emergency responder type positions, I just think in general, like the average man would probably have a hard time just admitting to his wife, I'm struggling and this is going on. And some of that is like, a lot of times there's this broken concept in our minds and in our culture, really, that struggle is synonymous with weakness. And then I think that gets
Vulnerability.
super,
Yeah.
yeah, good word, vulnerability. And I think that gets super amplified when you're talking about men and women in the context of serving in the armed forces, or some other extremely high stress environment. You mentioned something earlier that I wanted to circle back to. I just remembered it back in my mind. You mentioned about like kind of being in that position of somebody like in the military, for example, and looking up at somebody in leadership and being willing to talk about, share those scars, so to speak, being willing to talk about a struggle that they had or something like that. And you said, as somebody who's been in on both sides of that, let's say you're new, you're a young person, you're looking up to leadership thinking that like, no, like they're perfect, they have it all together, they don't have these struggles. I was thinking about it from the other side as well, of like being the person in that leadership role and the weight and the pressure of feeling like I have to have it all together. And then comparing yourself to other leaders and looking at them thinking they have it all together. It really, because they give the appearance that they have it all together. Meanwhile, in your mind, you're struggling, you're freaking out about stuff. And you're looking at them, you're like, oh, but look at these people that have gone before me and look at these other leaders around me. They don't seem to be struggling at all. So I guess I
Right.
just have to get over it. Or you start to even think like something's wrong with me for thinking this way or feeling this way. And I just think that overall, just finding ways, and so I love what you're doing, but finding ways to foster these kinds of conversations and to foster this kind of thinking, really, I think what it comes down to is like, it's okay for me to find people around me that I can trust, that I can relate to, and to admit when I am struggling with something. I don't necessarily have to tell like every single gory detail to a whole bunch of people, but like to be able to admit to myself
Right.
and to admit to others when I am struggling, when I do need to talk to somebody, when I do, if I need to take it to that next level of going to counseling or going through, getting connected with an organization like yours or whatever the case may be. But again, coming back to the fact that so much of this stuff that goes on in our brains is actually what our brain is designed to do to keep us safe. It doesn't mean that you're a broken person. And really what you're going through is something that probably a bunch of other people around you are going through, but they're just afraid for whatever reason to admit it as well. They don't want to come across as weak, or they don't want to risk, God forbid, losing their job or something like that because they're admitting that they're struggling with something. And so again, just like all that fear and all that stuff that goes on, I so appreciate you and everything that you've shared today. And that's just something that through the work of this organization with Liberty and others out there that are really focused on bringing help and healing into the lives of people and to families that have gone through trauma, that have experienced these post-traumatic stress situations and stressful environments and complex trauma and all these different things. To just in our culture in general, becoming more comfortable with the fact that admitting that you're struggling, admitting that you're going through something, admitting that you need help is not synonymous with weakness. It's not synonymous with you're broken. And I guess just becoming more and more comfortable with the emotional aspect of our lives with strength, recognizing that we can be emotional and strong. And actually, it's a serious exercise of strength, right? To admit
Super hard.
that
Yeah,
I need help. That's blowing past that comfort zone line. That's like, it's so much more comfortable for me to
absolutely.
just kind of hold on to this. That's an amazing feat of strength. And I think that we need to recognize and honor that in people when they're willing to step out and to kind of go against the grain and admit that they are struggling and admit that they need help, or whatever that, however that looks like for the individual person. But like, that's an amazing just feat of strength, of mental strength to do that. And I just, that's something I would just love to see. It's part of the reason I've been, wanting to have these conversations just on a personal level, just becoming more comfortable
Right.
in daily life of, talking about these things that tend to be taboo subjects.
Absolutely, and you're right. It's super tough to do that because of the dynamics, right? So if you're in whatever your job is, right? I mean, there's always competition, right? If you're looking to
True.
promote or excel in an organization, and you have a peer group that you're struggling, you're sharing that, hey, I'm struggling with this, right? Now you have a limited resource environment in which there's only one promotion, there's five of us, right? So only one. So doing that,
Yeah.
you think, oh man, I'm gonna, it's gonna be used against me or whatever. When in fact, when you do reach out for help and you get plugged into the amazing nonprofit organizations that are in this country, there's 50, 60, I think, thousand nonprofit organizations in the country specifically for veterans. And then there's a
Wow.
ton
Wow.
specifically for emergency responders, right? We just happen to
Mhm.
bridge both of them. And
Yeah.
when you learn that those resources are there, when you're willing to get on the other side of the fence to overcome that trauma, and whatever it is, right? I mean, there's a veterans running club, right? If you want to get physically fit, or there is a nonprofit organization for almost anything, right?
Come on.
And what happens is when you get plugged in, there's a sense of community. You have resources. People are lifting you up. They're holding you accountable, right? When you don't hold yourself accountable, they're going to hold you accountable. And what does that do for you as an individual, right? Gets those endorphins flowing, right? The cortisol levels in your body go down, right? Inflammation goes
Mm,
down, anxiety
yes.
goes down. You start to feel better, which means what? Now you're a more efficient, high performing individual at whatever, whether it's in your life, in your marriage, at
Mm,
your job, in your community, at your church, whatever that is. Now you're able to dive in and provide even more, right? So
come on.
people are very reluctant to reach out for help, that comfort zone thing that we're talking about. And what does it do? It really stagnates them from growing and stagnates them from being a force multiplier in their community,
Mm,
in whatever it is, right? Job, church, community, just in life. But there's organizations out there for everything. So I challenge any of you who are listening to this, if you're struggling, and get plugged into the 60,000 nonprofit organizations that are here in America willing to help, at a grassroots level. A vast majority of all these nonprofits, scratching and one for every single thing they can to provide a resource to help a veteran, right? None of these, when we talk about nonprofits, due to some of the other nonprofits that are really, really big, heavy hitters that, make millions and millions of dollars, a vast
mm,
majority of the nonprofit organizations are on a shoestring budget, and they do absolutely everything they can and take money out of their own pockets to provide
yeah.
resources to help other people. They're just
Yeah.
serving other people. And when you get in there and you start helping and you dive in, well, now you're a force multiplier and you're helping out even more people, which, it all comes back, and you grow as an individual, and you learn, and you just make yourself better and people around you better, which is just a big, there's a wonderful quote that, says, if you're not making someone else's life better, you're wasting your time. And so,
Wow.
People who have those nonprofits, that's their motto, kind of, this is where we're at in life, and we're just trying to help other people make the most of their life.
Love it, man. It's a good word. Well, Scott, let's go ahead and start wrapping this up, man. Liberty Organization for Veterans and Emergency Responders. You can find it at libertyove.com. That's www.libertyove.com. And Scott, if you would just take a minute and just any final thoughts on that come up, or if there's anywhere else that you would like to point people besides that website. I'm not sure if there is anything, like if there's a Facebook group or something like that, if there's anywhere else that you would point people beyond just the website itself. But just any kind of like final closing thoughts here that you have, and anywhere that you want to point anybody to.
Yeah.
And then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Yes, sir.
First, I want to thank you. Thank Dr. Royster for connecting all of us. You never know who you're going to come across, and who knows somebody and get you in a platform or present opportunities. So first off, I want to say thanks to both of you two. But for the people that are going to watch this, and you go all the way through the hour and 26 minutes and get to the end, thank you for staying plugged in. Thank you for everything you do. But if you're struggling from PTSD, you go to our libertyove.com. There's a Get Help Now button, and that'll bring up an email. It sends me directly an email, and I'll call you. It doesn't matter what time of day it is, and we'll get in touch, and I'll put you in touch, with someone who can help you. So first off, if you're struggling, please reach out. That's there for a reason. Visit our website. We didn't much about the protocol, but it's the Trauma Recovery Intervention Protocol, better known as TRIP. And once you go through it, you'll kind of understand what it is, and kind of just open up your mind to a whole new, different perspective when it comes to how to process trauma. And lastly, I just want to say thanks to, we call it Liberty Nation, everybody that helps Liberty, whether it's resources, whether it's volunteers, whether it is, just hitting the like and share button on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. We're on all the social media platforms, to include Twitter. So, I just want to thank Liberty Nation for helping us as we continue to push to help as many people overcome PTSD as we can, because we know that life on that other side of PTSD is so much sweeter, that fulfilled life, that loving life where you can help other people transform their lives and get even, better is something that is just truly a blessing. So I just want to thank Liberty Nation for helping us out and allowing us to go and push and be on, shows like this and to talk about these things and kind of normalize what we're doing. So there's less barriers to reach out and get help. Just the other day, there's a nonprofit organization, and I'm not going to say their name, but he was the president of that organization, and they were specifically set up and designed to combat PTSD and suicide among the veteran communities. And that individual ended up taking his life. So, we're not immune to it, even if we're all pushing. And it breaks my heart because, we have this protocol that's doing amazing things, and we're trying to get it to the highest levels. And so, we're pushing at every venue. So, we don't have to share that horrible news story that even a nonprofit president ended up taking his own life. So, that's what we do. That's why we wake up in the morning. That's why we push hard. And, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. Thanks to Duke and all his team for putting this on. And I'm just super grateful and appreciative. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, appreciative of you, sir, for real. Very, very appreciative of you for your time, for being here. And more than that, everything that you're doing and for your service, and just really, really appreciate it. Real quick, one more question. A friend of mine asked a while ago. If you could just answer this real quick. He said, "Is your
Okay.
training more group led or more one-on-one?"
So the training that we do offer, we can train 20 people at one time
Oh
to do
wow,
this. We go over
I did
the
not know
building
that.
blocks of kinesthetic disassociation. That's the technique that we use. And we use a little bit of NLP, which is neuro linguistic programming. And so we go through. It can be done in 2 days, but we like to do 3 days. And we teach day one the fundamental building blocks of what we do. Day two, we get to practice on each other, right? So you learn, where you're at in the script. We actually read a script. We don't freelance. We don't do anything. You stick to the script, and then there's a logic tree built into the script based on the client's response. And so we get through that. We learn the building blocks. We learn techniques to keep people safe and comfortable. Day two, we practice, and you get to watch a live clearing. We call it a clearing, a live event in which we neutralize a member who has PTSD. And then as we're doing it, you get to, at the end, you get to ask questions and things of that nature. And then the half a day on the third day is when we do follow-ups and things of that nature about any questions we may have, whether it's, because every single one is slightly different. People's responses are different. How you handle the responses are different. And so that half of a third day allows us to kind of do the what ifs, right? What if this
Mm-hmm.
happens? And what if that happens? And so we go back in the career, show where they are. These are the what ifs, and this is the response type of situation. But it's 3 full days of training. It's 2.5 full days of training, and when you come out, you're super comfortable executing administering the protocol and working and understanding and knowing what those typical responses are going to be.
Mm. Wow, good stuff. One other thing, real quick, that I wanted to ask you. I meant to ask you at the beginning. I just wanted to ask, what do people? So, like in the Air Force, what do people call you? Would it be Chief Hendrick, or how do they refer to you in just if it's regular conversation or something like that?
Yeah, it's just either Chief or Chief Hendrick.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Love that.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
again, thank you, sir. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to check out this conversation, whether you were watching live, listening on one of the podcast platforms, or however you consume this podcast. Really, really appreciate you. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out. Yeah, hope you'll join us for a future episode here. If this conversation today was insightful, if it challenged you, blessed you in some way, if you'd consider subscribing, sharing, or leaving a review, really, really appreciate that. And make sure that you check out those resources that Chief Hendrick was talking about a few minutes ago. And again, sir, thank you so much again.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Take care, everybody.